inhabitant term, it immediately conjures up this image of the kind of little black Sambo. You know, the little child with corkscrew hair and big wide bug eyes, big, you know, over-exaggerated thick lips, big nose and so on, and black skin.
You talk about excrement in relation to a body of people. You talk about pickaninnies. You deliberately choose, you know, a word which debases them, which makes them abject in relation to your civilization, which extrudes them, expels them from a community together. You are really talking about something which is operating, I think, in your own feelings and sensibilities at a very profound and often unconscious level.
Underlying Powell's speech was a deep-seated fear. He believed that immigration was fatally weakening the racial, religious and cultural ties that had bound his country together for centuries.
All of us need an identity which unites us with our neighbours, our countrymen, those people who are subject to the same rules and the same laws as us, those people with whom we might one day have to fight side by side to protect our inheritance, those people with whom we will suffer when attacked, those people whose destinies are in some way tied up with our own.
But the Labour government had recently announced an historic shift which would threaten Powell's deeply held views of what Britain was. The Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins, a Liberal reformer, argued that immigrants should no longer have to integrate. Newcomers could retain their own values. It was the birth of a new way of thinking about Britain, multiculturalism.
Roy Jenkins made a classic speech, which I contributed to, in which, among other things, he defined integration not as a flattening process which would turn everybody out in some kind of mold of a stereotyped Englishman, but would be a combination of equal opportunities accompanied by cultural diversity in an atmosphere of tolerance.
Diversity was the encouragement of people to live together in harmony despite their differences and rejoice in the differences rather than deplore them.
But Powell's wartime experience convinced him that this kind of diversity could only lead to violence. Powell spent 4 years in India. He was fascinated by the complexity and diversity of this ancient civilization. But he also deplored the violent divisions, above all between Hindu and Muslim, which undermined it. Powell saw how communal hatred tore India apart after independence. Around 500,000 people died during the creation of Islamic Pakistan. Powell believed Indian-style communalism was now rearing its head in his own Wolverhampton constituency.
Back in 1921, the people who ran the transport department here laid down that drivers and conductors should wear the uniform provided, and nothing but the uniform provided. They hadn't thought then of turbans coming into their town, except perhaps when Alibaba was the Christmas pantomime.
In 1968, Sikh bus drivers in Powell's constituency went on strike. They believed rules which banned the wearing of turbans and beards went against their religion. When a protester threatened to set fire to himself, the bus company backed down. Powell believed that religious and racial differences were being entrenched by the threat of violence.
Here is their means of showing that the immigrant communities can organize to consolidate their members, to agitate and campaign against their fellow citizens, and to overawe and dominate the rest.
Powell had no doubt where mass migration and race relations legislation were leading. only months before he had visited the United States. Race hate seemed to be tearing the country apart. In Chicago and Detroit, Powell witnessed violence at first hand.
A leader of his people, a teacher of all people, has fallen. The man who fought against violence is by violence destroyed.
Just 2 weeks before Powell's speech, the civil rights leader Martin Luther King was murdered by a white racist. Thousands were injured and tens of thousands were arrested in rioting that followed. America seemed to be on the brink of ethnic war.
He began to feel that in 10-15 years' time, Britain would simply become the carbon copy of the United States, reproducing exactly the same sort of problems that the United States was facing at the time. And I think any politician, if this is how he saw the situation, he owed it to himself and to his country to say, look, this is what I feel, this is what I fear.
Only by halting immigration, Powell argued, could Britain be saved from Armageddon.
In these circumstances, nothing will suffice but that the total inflow for settlement should be reduced at once to negligible proportions, and that the necessary legislative and administrative measures should be taken without delay.
Powell ended his speech with a line from the Roman poet Virgil, which summed up his deep sense of anxiety. It is one of the most misquoted lines in British political history.
As I look ahead, I am filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood.
How many among his listeners knew what the Tiber was and where that reference came from? Doesn't matter. He got the image. Even those people who don't fully understand what you're saying get the point because they get it in their stomachs, in their hearts, rather than in their heads. This extraordinary figure who is very cerebral, but who, when he speaks about race, is not being as cerebral as all that. He is speaking from the gut, too. An Englishman's gut.
Mr. Powell received a considerable amount of applause for what he said. There were members of Parliament and candidates and leading members of the Conservative Party there who in no way indicated any dissent from what Mr. Powell was saying at that time.
He left the hotel and went to the home of his friend Clement Jones, whose wife Marjorie had been looking after Powell's 2 daughters for the day.
My mother had got the speech. My father had brought it home from the office of the Express and Star. They'd been unable to use it that day because Powell had put an embargo on it. But of course, when my mother read it, she was shocked. And it was the sight, I think, of words like grinning pickaninnies is clearly what upset my mother most of all. She said that there was no way that she could ever spend time with Enoch Powell again. My mother handed over the girls, and Powell said, well, that looks like the end of a very good friendship. And my mother said yes. So it was a real defining moment for my mother and father. I think this was the moment when they had to make a stand. It hurt them. I know that it probably hurt the Powells as well, but that was the moment in family history, a searing moment.
Meanwhile, footage of the speech was dispatched south. The bomb that Powell had primed was about to explode.